Good day to you. Joining you from my front yard today, and just over my shoulder there is the university. Yeah, it's set down there in that little valley. And across the university and beyond the university and across the world, which is behind my shoulder, what do you think is the language that is spoken by the most number of people across the world? Is it English? No, it's not English. It's Chinese. It's Mandarin Chinese, spoken by more people in the world than English. What's the second language? Is it English? No, it's not English. It's Spanish, spoken by more people. And yet you probably grew up thinking that English is the language that's spoken by more people than any other language in the world. And in a way, you would be right, because English, despite being the third most spoken language people-wise, is actually the most dominant language on the planet. And we're going to be highlighting that and other ideas today because we're talking about language now as a barrier to communication. We're talking about language as a barrier to communication. How can we ever overcome those language barriers is ultimately what we want to get to. In my lifetime, I think across the generations of young people, and I think about the different sayings that people have had. My daughter told me when she was going to ESU a couple years ago that students call me savage. And I had to ask her what that meant, savage, like a renegade person. And then I've heard sayings like throwing shade. I'm not sure if that has a racist dimension to it by today's standards, but that's a term that's being used. And then we can go back maybe like 15 years ago, and I remember the word "da bomb" was being thrown around campus quite a bit. She's the bomb. And then I go back to my own 1970s mellow out sayings. So these are phrases, sayings, slang, parochialisms, if you know that term, which describe generations. And generations are always inventing languages. And now we're going to delve deeper to talk about how languages can operate as barriers to communication. Languages can operate as barriers in two senses. One is through translation problems, and the second is through language as nationalism. We'll be focusing on both of those today. But let's first define what language is. Language is really just a set of symbols. Those symbols can be words, they can be gestures, they can be emojis. It's a set of symbols shared by a community to communicate meaning and experiences. Pretty simple, right? Language, however, becomes a barrier when the full meaning is not shared. So if you look across the world, there are actually over 7,000 languages spoken. But English is the dominant language because it is the preferred language in diplomacy, in commerce, on the internet, in tourism, on email. Yeah, English, that's where English flexes its muscle. Now let's move to something called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. You can read about the interesting background of these two individuals. One was actually a firefighter, a firefighting engineer, and they got together because they had had a lot of experience traveling around the world and studying people and the way that language is used, and they decided to come up with a hypothesis called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, named after their two last names. And that hypothesis says that the structure of language determines our thoughts and languages. The structure of language determines our thoughts and our actions. That is how we are designing our sentences. What has to come first? A predicate, subject, noun, verb, etc. That structure then also determines our thoughts and languages. And they looked at two areas, vocabulary being one of them. And so, for example, they talked about how if a country has a large set of terms to describe something, then it is reasonable to assume that that thing that those terms are describing is very important to the culture. So Eskimos, for example, you know that Eskimos have many words for snow. Just a few words of them are listed in the book. And that highlights the importance of having to know what kind of snow is out there. And even those of you who are skiers or snowboarders in the class, you know there's different kinds of snow that will affect the way that you ski and whether you decide to go skiing. And so Eskimos have snow as a very important function in their lives, and you can tell that by looking at all the words that they have for snow. Similarly, if you look at the United States, we have so many different words for describing how to sell something. We have words like a pitch, a sale, the close. leveraging business, scoring a deal, netting a deal, getting a deal, promoting a deal. We have a lot of different words. So selling is very important in the United States. The Yanumu tribe, Hanumu tribe, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, in the Philippines, has 92 words for rice. 92 different words to describe a basic staple of their lives, highlighting how important rice must be to the survival of that tribe. And the Japanese have many words to describe seasons. Seasons change so subtly in Japan that they have 22 different sub-seasons. We have just 4. The Japanese basically have 24 different sub-seasons across the U.S., highlighting how important it is when you're an island, how important it is to you to be aware of your weather and your surroundings, because otherwise you're vulnerable. So that's one area of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that our vocabulary structures our thoughts. In this case, structures them towards believing that an item is more important to a culture by virtue of how many words there are to describe it. Next up, as part of the hypothesis, is grammar. Grammar is the way that sentences are structured, both orally and written. If we take a very basic example, if I want to say I love you in the English language, it's I, you're taking the subject, love is the verb, and then you comes at the end of the sentence. I am doing something to you if I'm loving you. I am loving you. I'm doing that to you. You're the recipient of my love. If I want to say I love you in French, je t'adore. Je is I, ta is really an abbreviation of you, and then comes the word adore, which is a rough equivalent word for love in French. So you're saying I, you love. It's a totally different structure in the sentence. It's saying that you and me together, literally you and me are together in the sentence. I, you, and then comes the affectation that describes us, what puts us together. It's a different way of structuring our thought processes, and it's because of the grammar. Similarly, in Turkey, my colleague Cem Zeytinoğlu, I don't speak Turkish, but he tells me, one difference between the Turkish language and American English is that they don't really have a word to start their sentences off, where they're starting their sentences off with I. So Turkish people are rarely talking about themselves. They can talk about me, something's happening to me, but not I leading. Whereas in the United States, we use that word very frequently. It's how we begin most of our sentences. If you have only to look at Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or any of the social media where people are telling their stories and exchanging information, a lot of people are responding to what others are doing by saying, I did that too. Very, very similar. Now we're going to move on to some critiques of that hypothesis. The first one is the linguistic relativism critique. Linguistic relativism. This says that language only shapes our thoughts and actions, that language and cultural norms shape each other, that language is not as determining a factor as people say, that only shapes our thoughts and actions. And 2 examples that are part of this critique of the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis as part of linguistic relativism. The first one is the coordinate bilingual speaker. That's the first area of criticizing the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis. A coordinate bilingual speaker is a person who learns a language later on in life and uses it in limited context. For example, that would be me when it comes to Spanish. Me gusta practicar mi español. Yo quiero practicar mi español. I like to practice Spanish. I want to practice Spanish. That's about as far as I can get. I don't have a lot of knowledge of verb tenses. I'm mostly focusing on vocabulary as I'm trying to learn the language. I would be a coordinate bilingual speaker. Many of you in this class, same situation. Many of you have grown up in these kinds of households. You said so in your intro video. The research on coordinate bilingual speakers says that these people tend to group objects on the basis of categories rather than relationships. So somebody who's using a word, muy caliente, okay, that's very hot. That's how I would describe a day like today. It's going to be very hot in the 90s here in Pennsylvania. That's how I would describe it if I was in Mexico. It's taking the day and it's grouping it into the category of hot. It's either hot or muy frío. It'd be very cold. Very simple categories in which you group objects. Now let's compare that to compound bilingual speakers. Compound bilingual speakers learn a second language early on in life, and they therefore can use it in many contexts. And therefore, people who are compound bilingual speakers, they are more open and they're able to discuss relationships rather than objects. So they may say that it's a hot day, but they may also comment, well, is this an example of global warming? Or it's a hot day, and is that because we are in the season where we're starting to experience hurricanes and other turbulence that are in the ocean? There's a more of a discussion of relationships. And so this linguistic relativism is seeking to prove that there is not necessarily a determining feature of language and its structure that's going to make us act in certain ways. It is simply only a shaping influence. Now, I said there were going to be more than one critique of the warp-Sapir hypothesis. There is just the one, linguistic relativism. Now I'd like to move on to a case study. The case study in the chapter talks about Arab culture. Arabic is a language that's spoken by 295 million people, almost 300 million people across the world. It is strongly influenced by the Quran, the holy book of Islam. The Quran is a much more comprehensive, some would say, document than the Bible because it discusses law, it discusses property ownership, it discusses a lot of areas that are beyond just quote-unquote morals. And so one of the reasons, one of the hallmarks of Arabic is that when you pray in Islam, you must pray in Arabic. And there's not the same sort of expectation for Catholicism, for example, in praying in either Spanish or English, but you must pray in Arabic. Arabic is a difficult language to get a handle on. I'm not an Arabic speaker, believe me. I'm not trying to present myself as anything other than an armchair, semi-expert here. Arabic emphasizes artistry through metaphor. So instead of saying, for example, the English saying might be, oh, we missed you if you haven't seen somebody for a while and finally they join you for a happy hour or whatever. Instead, the Arabs might phrase that kind of sentiment as, you made us desolate with your absence. There's a dramatic, metaphorical, lyrical quality to it. Similarly, in Arabic, the rhetoric of confrontation through verbal threats is very common. I'm going to take you outside and you are never going to come back again. These kinds of things are said and, it's blown over the next day. It's part of the inflammatory expectation of Arabic. And similarly, there's a quality of Arabic that is hard to nail down. There's a saying that if an Arab says yes, it means maybe. And if an Arab says maybe, it means no. And that kind of ties back into saving face, the idea of saving face, that it's very difficult to put a person down in Arabic. Instead, it becomes this read between the lines. When I say maybe, I really mean no. All right, let's move on now to translation problems. We said at the outset that we were going to highlight how translation problems create barriers to intercultural communication. And there's several translation problems that can come into play. One of them is vocabulary equivalence. It's just a plain fact that you have words in some languages that just do not translate into other languages. For example, in Iceland, they had to invent a word when television was invented. Television is an English word, right? It's a tele, transmitting, vision, right? Simple word, television. In Iceland, they didn't have a Scandinavian, Icelandic word that was going to fit that, so they had to invent a word that means something like pictures all around us. That's the word for television in Icelandic, meaning there is no equivalency. There is no term for that term in Iceland. There's no term for television in Iceland. And translation problems happen all the time. That's why it amazes me when we listen to American news or see American news or read American news, wherever you're getting American news, and it's about another country where a foreign leader has made a statement. And if that foreign leader has not made the statement in English, then we are totally reliant upon the translation of that statement. And we just don't know whether that's what the leader really, really said. And yet, I guess it's possible that we take it at face value. Translation problems occur all the time. In Japan, for example, there's a story in the book about how there were some American businessmen going to meet with Japanese businessmen, and the American business people, I should say, although it probably was men. American business people said to the Japanese, We wonder if you would prepare an agenda for us. And the wonder was meant to indicate, politeness. We're not forcing you to prepare the agenda, but would you like to? And the Japanese, unfortunately, can try and find a translation for that that's not there, and they come up with doubt. Doubt is the closest translation for wonder. So we doubt that you can prepare an agenda for us. It puts them on the defensive. Next up, as a translation problem other than vocabulary equivalence, is idiomatic equivalence. Do you know that word, what an idiom is? An idiom is a localized saying, and we have localized sayings to our culture. For example, we sometimes might find it harsh to say that somebody passed away, or even that is a way of not saying directly that somebody has died. But we have other ways of saying it, like he kicked the bucket. I mean, how do you translate that into a foreign culture? Somebody would literally wonder, what does that mean? If you go to Amish country here in Pennsylvania, where I went to Millersville University for my undergraduate degree, there's a lot of Amish sayings built on the structure of the Germanic language. It's known as Pennsylvania Dutch, but it's actually Swiss people. That's where the Amish came from, the mountains of Switzerland, using the German language. And they have all these sayings like, are you being have? Are you being have? Yeah, that's a Dutch saying. How are you going to translate that even into English? Next up as a translation problem is grammatical syntactical equivalence. Grammatical syntactical equivalence, that's the structure of the sentence. And again, I've already demonstrated through I love you, said in French and Spanish and English, that just very simple structure of a sentence can change the way the meaning is interpreted. Then also you have experiential equivalence, some experiential equivalence. Let's take a phrase like department store. Are you going to be able to translate department store in the jungle of Congo? I mean, tribal cultures in the jungle of Congo, they're not going to have any clue what a department store is because they don't have that experience. The U.S. doesn't have the Swedish law called allemansratten. Allemansratten is a very interesting law to me. It basically says in Sweden that nobody privately owns the land so that nobody else can use it. And allemansratten means every man's right, should be every person's right. And what that law stipulates is that anybody can camp, can stay overnight on anybody's land, but as long as they are X amount of feet from the house, as long as they leave the next day, and as long as they don't do any damage whatsoever to the property. It opens up the whole entire country and makes the country everybody's country rather than just pieces of it. And actually, I've seen allemansratten in practice. I've actually camped that way myself in Sweden. And there's a tremendous amount of respect that goes on. You don't find people drinking and leaving beer bottles all over and damaging. You just don't find stuff like that. It's a word that we are not going to have a translation equivalence for in the United States because, for a start, we don't really believe in that idea of not having private property, and therefore we just don't have that experience. All right, I'd like to move on now to a general category of pidgin language, Creole, universal languages. It's all sort of under the same category. A pidgin language, P-E-D-G-I-N, is a mixture of two or more languages to form a new language. It's in the beginning stages of that process. We can say that Spanglish is a language that might qualify as a pidgin language. It's in the fairly new process. You go down around in southern parts of the United States and you find places where Latinos and Americans have long had a history together, and many people don't realize, by the way, that 1/3 of the United States used to be part of Mexico. Yeah, all the way up through Wisconsin. Can you believe that? And Utah, can you believe that? Can you believe that parts of Wyoming? Yeah, all those were Mexican states, including, of course, the obvious ones like California, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Texas. Yeah, so Mexicans kind of have a joke when they talk about immigration. Like, what are you worried about immigration? We never left. We're still in your country, the United States. And so, but because of that, we have this mixture of Spanish and English that's constantly going on. You find that in people using sentences that have both Mexican or both Spanish and English words. People say adios, is a very simple thing, even though they're English speakers. All right, so compare that next to a Creole language. A Creole language, Many of you who have Caribbean backgrounds in this class, and South American backgrounds in this class, and Central American backgrounds in this class, you know what I'm talking about. A Creole is a new language that's developed from prolonged contact of two or more languages. And Creole is kind of a food term, right? It's used very much in New Orleans. It means coming together of all these ingredients. And there's one particular kind of Creole language that's spoken in the Caribbean called patois. And patois is in itself a French term, but it's a language that became spoken as part of the slave trade by the slaves. And so you have a lot of the slaves who are in the boats around the ships, and a lot of slaves that are on the boats, and they developed their own language as a code so that they could speak in private amongst themselves, so that they could use this language to discuss their fate. So patois is made up of Portuguese, which are in the Caribbean. It's made up of French. Sometimes it has some Dutch in it, some English in it. It's a mixture of words, and it's a kind of a new language. It was a kind of a secret language, right? And now, do you know about the language Esperanto? Interesting idea. Esperanto, it was a language developed by a Polish citizen at the age of 19. Lazarus Zemhoff. 19, he developed this language that he thought could be a world language. Now, it was before English had taken over as the world's language, so there were a lot of competing languages. German was a language of science. French was a language of diplomacy. English was just getting started. And so he thought, with all this competition, we can invent this language, Esperanto, which is a basic simplified language. All right, I'd like to move on now to another area of discussing language as a barrier to intercultural communication. That's going to be language as nationalism. Like MAGA, Make America Great Again. That's a kind of language that's reinforcing language. It's reinforcing nationalism. Nationalism is pride in your nation state, and it can extend beyond nationalism. It can go into areas that are considered to be, fascist when you get past nationalism. I'm not saying all nationalism is that way, but that's always the danger of nationalism, where your country is assumed to be of superior quality in people, race, gender, education, economics to other countries, and therefore your country is right. We saw that happen with Germany in World War II. So when we're talking about language as nationalism, we're talking about how it can have a bad effect on intercultural communication. And Jacob Grimm of Grimm's Fairy Tales, he said that a nation is nothing more than the totality of people who speak the same language. When you think about that, it's very, very true. When you think about the United States, we're mostly an English-speaking country, but we do have French-speaking quarters. Canada has also a similar situation with the province of Quebec. China, for centuries, had a very difficult time coming together as one country because there were so many languages that were spoken. It was not until Mandarin took over as the main Chinese language that the country could actually unite together. So countries are inextricably bound to language in many, many ways. English is a very interesting language. It is a language that has spread all over the world and become the most important language. And where does it start off? It starts off as Germanic peoples, mainly from Germany and Denmark. They conquered Britain, parts of Britain. They invaded Britain. I don't know, maybe conquered's the right way. It makes it sound a little bit too organized, but they invaded Britain in the 5th century. And they started to develop a language that would suck in terms from other languages. And that's what makes English such an impressive language. It's like a giant vacuum cleaner. It can take a word like croissant, which is a French word. Means crescent, right? We say croissant when we say it in the US, but it's really croissant. And it's a French word, means crescent. And we'll talk about that for breakfast. It's just one tiny example of words that we pull in all the time, and they just become part of the English language. Other languages are not written that way, like Iceland. I gave you as an example, could not fit television into its structure, but that's no problem for English. So English is basically built on the structure of the Germanic language, but it borrows vocabulary from French and Spanish and other places. And today English dominates in science, technology, commerce, tourism, diplomacy, pop culture for sure, and academic discourse. If you want to be published, if you want your work to get out there, it has to be published in English. Where is English? Well, for a start, it's in India. Can you believe that? India, a country, does that seem like a country that should be speaking English? Well, what happened there was the UK ruled India for over 200 years. And so they brought with them their school system, they brought with them the English language, and now most people in India are speaking English. Websites in India are even in English. If you make a phone call and you need customer service, how many times do you get somebody on the line who sounds like they're in India? They have these monstrous call centers in India just for that very reason, because most Indians are speaking English and they're able to handle that kind of job. Other places where you find English include South Africa, although South Africa has its own language that's been developed called Afrikaans. This is the first language that's a Germanic language that's been developed outside of Europe. So it has the structure of Germanic languages, but it includes Malay, Portuguese, French, German, English, and African languages. And by the way, many African languages in Africa are only in oral form. Talk about a barrier to communication. If you want to speak with some African people, many Africans, much of Africa, I should say, is still tribal. People living in tribal areas. When you get to the cities, it's a different situation. But many of these tribes have languages that only have an oral form. You cannot write them down. So from a mass media standpoint, no web pages for these people, no newspapers for these people. If you want to speak with these people, they can't teach you by writing down their language. They have to teach you orally. And that's a situation I think is very, very unique. And you also find it in South America and Asia as well. Other places where English is spoken, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and of course the United States. I'm going to let you read that material in the book on your own so that I don't extend the video too long here. But let's do highlight that there has been a loss of American Indian languages or Native American languages. Before the arrival of the Europeans here in the U.S., there were about 400 to 600 indigenous languages spoken, including right here in Pennsylvania. Our university is right in the heart of many nations of indigenous Americans heritage-wise. We've got the Lenape Indians, for example, the Shawnee Indians, the Mincie Indians. That's what they were called, Indians, and Mincie indigenous people. Mincie Nation is a better way to say it. Until the Spanish crown, so the loss of, that's the next point. So the loss of American languages is down to about 175 today because of our long and sordid history of suppressing and exterminating Native American peoples by the Trail of Tears, having them walk across the United States and putting them into what is essentially concentration camps or reservations, as we better know them. So luckily, though, in 1990, Congress did pass the Native American Language Act to try and preserve those languages, try and reinvigorate instructions on reservations so that people can be instructed in the languages of their heritage. And then we also want to talk about Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is has an interesting relationship to the United States. It is what is known as a Commonwealth. It was originally populated by indigenous peoples, the Taino, T-A-I-N-O, and the Caribe Indians. Caribe native Puerto Ricans were populating that island until the Spanish invaded, and it was claimed by the Spanish crown. And then eventually Puerto Rico was purchased by the U.S. And so language has become a kind of a sticking point, because you may or may not know that Puerto Rico is constantly trying to consider whether it wants statehood. Does it want to be the 51st state in the United States, or does it want to retain its independence? And language is a big problem. Officially, English and Spanish are both equal in official languages of Puerto Rico, but if Puerto Rico ever wants to become a state, it probably will have to declare that English is going to be the main language. All right, so yeah, that pretty much wraps up what I want to talk about for today, language as barriers to communication. I hope as you go throughout your day discussing that even at a micro level, when you have conversations with people, you can consider some of these ideas in whether you're able to gain the meaning that you hope and whether they gain the meaning that they hope to expect from you. Have a great day.